Secretary of State Phil McGrane, how are you?
Great. How are you, man?
I'm doing really well. I'm really happy that we've been able to do this series, especially with these shorter little hits of shows, because I keep getting more and more feedback. One of the things that people keep coming back to is IDs in elections. And again, it's a national talking point. I know people are really upset about it. And I believe there was a law passed recently. Elon Musk articulated it, that like you can, at poll workers in different elections in California, you just can't even show an ID. And again, that's Elon Musk. If that's true or not, it's not my affair. But in this state, there are two things that people have to consider with IDs. You have registering to vote and you have actually going to vote. Registering to vote, you must have an ID. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. These are IDs that are distributed by, like, for instance, you need an Idaho
government
driver's.
IDs.
Yeah, these are government IDs. And not even government IDs, from any state. But we're going to talk about very specific IDs. Talking about how they get those IDs in Idaho, because people are like, oh, they're handing out IDs, driver's licenses to non-citizens, and then they can go and vote. It's like, nope, that's not true. In fact, because there's a distinction in IDs and ID classification that ITD, Idaho Transportation Department, does have. I'm sorry, I'm talking way too much. Here we go. Talk to me about the IDs required to vote in Idaho.
Yeah, I think one of the things, especially for people moving here to the state, we get the question a lot about IDs. And yes, we do require ID to register to vote, just like you said. It doesn't matter. You must show ID in order to register to vote. And then additionally, you'll be asked to show ID when you vote. I think one of the biggest groups right now that we're worried about headed into the November 5th election is anybody who recently moved here, whether they've taken the time to get their Idaho driver's license. One of the things about our law is it does require an Idaho ID card or an Idaho driver's license. So the Washington, Oregon, California driver's license aren't sufficient to show ID. So either right now is a great time to go schedule an appointment, visit the sheriff's office and update your driver's license, like make it permanent that you're moving here to Idaho. Or somebody will need like a passport, military ID, concealed carry permit from the state of Idaho also works. But really, they are mostly Idaho IDs, other than a couple of those federal ones like a passport. And what we see too is overwhelmingly people use an Idaho driver's license. That's the most common form of ID. We did update our laws 2 years ago in terms of registration to be more specific, to your point, about these must be IDs that are issued and vetted in terms of who the person is, what their information is. And then we share a lot of that information. You and I have talked about this in the past, like the ITD information to validate somebody's registration.
Okay, so taking that into account then, when people talk about driver's licenses in the state of Idaho, and that it is possible, and again, it is possible for somebody who is here on a work visa that is not a citizen, it should not be capable of voting under our current laws. It is possible for that person to get a driver's license, but that driver's license has some unique classification or identification on it that if they attempt to use that to vote in our elections, that will not work. Is that correct?
So there's a couple of things with that. Yes, like it is possible that somebody here who's on a work visa, it's a perfect example, can get an Idaho driver's license. Depending on the nature of the visa, there'll be different indicators in terms of that license. But additionally, all of it is recorded with ITD. So they have like 9 different classifications for, so citizenship being one of those. And that information is shared with us. So it's not just the physical presentation of the ID to the poll worker. A lot of people focus on that, but it's also the information exchange. When someone goes to voteidaho.gov, they'll actually see when you type in your information and you put your driver's license in, it's because we are in real time going to the Idaho Transportation database and comparing your information, including that citizenship designation, as we're doing it to flag or block anybody who shouldn't be able to register to vote. And the same thing, we just went through with the executive order doing a full review of all million-plus registered voters in the state of Idaho to validate and make sure that there aren't non-citizens participating in our elections.
Okay. Talk to me about the executive order, because when that came out and I saw the headline, instantaneously, I was like, I knew I should be happy about, like, this is great because I think, Idaho's doing a very good job. But I instantaneously knew that just the fact that that executive order exists will support people's anxieties that, like, oh, there are all of these gigantic problems and Idaho's just trying to get ahead of it. Now, you have been very clear in past, and I'm sure in future conversations, that it's like, yeah, look, we have voter fraud. and we prosecute it, and
Yes.
we have it in the order of, single or double digits throughout the entire state. We don't have it in the order of, thousands or 10,000s, and certainly not in specific precincts, because, you don't even have precincts that have, like 10,000 people. So talk to me about that executive order, because this is something where it's like, look, we're doing a good job, but we can do an even better job.
Yeah, and I think just doing the due diligence. So the executive order, Citizens Only Can Vote Act, Governor Little signed it back in July. Really, that was in response to a lot of questions that we were receiving about citizenship. So the national narrative that you talked about, especially with the immigration crisis at the border, part of it was for us, and he really asked our office, like, are we doing everything we can to ensure that only citizens are voting? And so we've gone through and looked at the process. So just like I mentioned, that voteidaho.gov registration process, are we doing the validations in real time that we need to be doing to ensure that only a citizen can go through that process and check? We've been doing that. Right. We've confirmed it. Same thing when somebody's registering at the local elections office. But in addition to that, we also reviewed every single registered voter on Idaho's voter rolls to go through and say, can we make sure we can validate with the tools we have that they are citizens? So part of that was working with ITD. That's one of our main partners. You hear me talk about that all the time. Also working with Department of Homeland Security. That was a really significant upgrade to our process this year, was we now have an agreement with them to be able to validate citizenship information. So getting into your work visas and other instances to say, like, is there potentially a green card holder who registered thinking that they could vote when realistically they can't? You have to be a citizen. And so we've gone through and done a comprehensive review over the past few months. And I'm really happy to say, like, we did have a good system in place. The tools are working. Out of I think we're now at 1,040,000 registered voters in the state. We identified 36 non-citizens that we are actively, to your earlier point, working with law enforcement and contacting those individuals specifically to, one, make sure they don't vote in the upcoming election, and two, to make sure we take the appropriate steps with our law enforcement partners that anybody who's trying to participate in our elections who shouldn't be would expect.
Okay, so out of the million plus people, 36 of them, how did you get? Do you have any idea about how they were capable of registering in the first place, or is it?
It's all really
forms of identification.
Yeah, it's all really case by case basis. Some of it, I think, one of the things that stood out to me from it in a couple of the instances is it looks like it happened far enough back when we didn't have some of the tools that we have now. And I'm not going like way back, but sure. I think one of the things to put into context, these like databases and comparisons, whether it's federal, state, doesn't matter, or at the county level, this is all this technology is newer. I mean, you and I didn't have cell phones in high school. Right. Like all of these tools, we're getting better and better and better at it. And being able to do a mass comparison like this, and being able to do things like do that ITD check in real time through our website, that's all newer technology. And it's really empowering us to make sure that things, everyone always talks about elections in Chicago back in the 60s or something. Right. We've gone light years from there in terms of our comparisons.
You keep bringing up Chicago. Like what?
I don't know. I've never even been into Chicago, and certainly have not voted in any elections. Right? Yeah. Not to disparage my colleagues in Chicago, but
from the 60s.
Yes, from the 60s. That I have no idea.
Yeah.
No, but I think like we're one of the things we validated is that even though we identified these individuals, none of them had voted in the primary election that we just took place.
Gotcha.
So that's important. And I think, we've talked about the absentee or other forms of potential voter fraud, is that we are doing something about it. I think there's this sentiment like, oh, people don't care, no one's looking, everyone just looks the other way. And it's like, no, we care a lot. We care deeply. And so we are actively engaged. County clerks across the state are making contact with voters. You've talked to Trent Triple in the past. I can tell you he deeply cares about making sure that he has absolute confidence that when the results come out here after the November election, that he can stand by them and say, oh, no, I know that the people who voted are allowed to vote. And I know that the votes that we counted are accurate. Trent and I, in the 2020 election, had a race that was 2 votes apart out of 40,000 votes cast. Any one of these variances could have an impact on a race like that. And so preparing that it's possible in this election, we could have another really close race. We need to make sure we're doing everything possible to give people confidence about the election process.
Here's a question for you. Somebody had brought up the absentee voting. First off, how many what portion of votes are cast in person versus absentee?
Oh, so the breakdown, Idahoans like to vote on election day at the polls, overwhelming. So about 70% of Idahoans will choose to vote on election day at the polls. That's going to be the big day, which is kind of what most people expect. But you know this, many other states do it differently, especially our neighboring states. We'll have probably about 12% will vote early in person. So in-person early voting just started. So if you go to your local elections office or here, like one of the city halls, you can vote in person just in advance. And then absentee voting will be a little over 15%. Gotcha. That's typically what we see. And we're already, I think we're about 50,000 ballots have already been cast in the current election here across the state. And those are absentee voters who participated.
Okay. So just over 15%. Got it. Somebody was bringing up a concern a week or two ago about the ability for somebody to be moving away and still voting in Idaho elections using an absentee ballot. Now, people have to request a ballot, right? These things are not automatically sent. And what is the criterion? Well, first off, that's correct, right? They have to request it. But then what is the criterion by which, like, if Trent Trimble at Ada County gets a request and the request is going to like Portland, and then they're like, okay, if you're an Idaho person and you want to vote in the Idaho elections, but you're having me send the absentee ballot to Portland, like, what's the process that you go through to determine, I don't think you're an Idaho resident anymore? Like, is there, what is that?
You know, that's actually a really good nuanced question in terms of, one, absentee voting. The general genesis is you will have ballots that are mailed to people elsewhere. So somebody's doing work for Micron and they happen to be in Virginia. Sure. They need to get their Virginia ballot. Or in Idaho, especially headed into November, I think fall is now hitting us. That means a bunch of the snowbirds are starting to cool off. And so they need to go to Arizona to get warm. That happens across. So we definitely see that. I think there's we're in this gap. So registration has now closed in Idaho, other than same-day registration in person. Part of that is, in order to be an Idahoan for voting purposes, you have to have lived here 30 days. Many other states have similar requirements. You can only be a resident of one or the other state. We're now at a point in time where someone may not be eligible to register to vote in Oregon. So it is actually appropriate for them to vote in Idaho, or vice versa. We will have people moving. So someone moves to California this week, gets here to Idaho, and they're like, I'm ready to vote. And like, sorry, you haven't been here 30 days. If you want to vote, contact the state of California. That's your only opportunity, because you're at this point in time, you're still a Californian until you have met the residency requirements of the state of Idaho.
Oh, wow. I had no idea that was a thing. I thought it was wherever you're standing is like you get to vote.
No, it's the distinction too between like taking a vacation to Idaho and choosing to move to Idaho, right? Most people who come to move here probably took a vacation to scope things out. That doesn't make them an Idahoan yet. Gotcha. It's not until they actually locate here and plant that then they become an Idahoan and are eligible, whether it's driver's license, to vote or anything else. And so there is this kind of, it's not a gap, because we don't want to disenfranchise anybody. We have a major presidential election. People need to be able to vote for president, but we have to kind of work through that process. But you have to be here 30 days. And then you go through what we already talked about, show your ID, get your Idaho driver's license. I think that's one of the biggest things. I think you said it. Lots of the advice for Californians is change the plates on your car right when you get here. While you're changing your plates, I'm just encouraging you to also get your new driver's license.
Man, I still have my 510 phone number, and I got a 208. And because everybody's like, you got to switch to 208, bro. Like, nobody knows who it is. Everybody thinks it's a spam call when I call. But I've had that phone number since I was 21. I'm like, I'm not giving, like, this is part, like, if I get a tattoo,
part of your identity.
I'm going to tattoo it on my arm. Like, it's going to the grave with me. Somebody online actually about a week ago asked me, they're like, well, what about the like, I don't know how I put it. He was like the libs. He was like, what about the libs who were like the fake Idahoans and couldn't hack it here, and then they moved out of state, but they're still messing with our politics? I'm like, well, you have to request about, like, Phil's going to know if it's like going, to Washington, and it goes to Washington every single year. And then I started thinking, like, okay, what do I know? I should ask Phil, you know, like, so what is the process by which Idaho determines, like, okay, I think this person has actually permanently moved out of state. Because we had an instance in the Boise school district, in fact, where, they had a board member that was
sure.
going to school in a different state and, living there. But I mean, this person was living there, going to school, and I don't know, they met the requirements to maintain their board position here, and whatever, Boise school district gets to do whatever they want. But from a voting standpoint, how do we know when somebody has moved out permanently and should no longer have a voice in Idaho?
It's a challenge. So the number one thing, and we see this come up in a variety of ways, is you can only be a citizen of one state at any given time. You're either an Idahoan or Californian or an Idahoan or a Wyomingian. I don't know if that's what you say, but we see this because people will say sometimes, well, I want to get the free ID in Idaho so I can vote in Idaho, but I want to keep my Wyoming driver's license because I'm going to, you're like, no, that's not how this works. You are a resident of one state at any given time. Now you determine which state that is. Now that's not necessarily where your feet are planted, which I think is the core of your question. We have lots of Idahoans who are not physically present in Idaho. We have missionaries all across the world. We have military members all across the world. But we also have, and I think this gets lost, is like we have lots of workers. Like we have big industry here in the state of Idaho. We are the headquarters for Albertsons, Micron. We have the Idaho National Laboratory. There are people moving all the time, and they may be gone for long stints. A great person, if you talk to, is Congressman Russ Fulcher. He used to work for Micron previously, and he spent years at a time overseas and doing work on behalf of Micron. He never lost being an Idahoan. He's a multi-generation. He'll tell you he's a dairy farmer from Cuna, right? That all of that is true, and he's still so. You have that nuance. So there are people who may go spend time in Washington, for example. They remain an Idahoan until they decide, nope, I've moved to Washington to do it. Now, we do share information. So Washington will inform us when they both get a Washington driver's license or register to vote in the state of Washington or vice versa. I will say we don't see a lot of people, to the fear that your emailer said, wanting to meddle in Idaho politics while living in another state. Because as soon as they're there for like 15 days... they care about the politics wherever they are, because they're being impacted by the decisions. Right. Interestingly, sorry,
you're dying over here.
I am.
Yeah.
And getting me all choked up there, Matt.
And again, that would make sense, which is the idea that people are moving like that. One of the things people say is like, all of these blue people are moving here to like ruin our politics. It's like, how much do you think you exist in my head? Like I moved here without knowing anyone. And it's like, I wasn't moving here and moving my entire family away from the 5-mile radius I had lived my entire life in my former state, so I could mess with your politics. Like that just doesn't hold water. Like why would I do that?
You and I know this because I've shared the data, the Idaho people moving to Idaho, right? It's just the opposite. People are moving here because of the politics, not to change the politics here, to participate because they're like, oh, I'm a lifelong Republican who's lived in the Bay Area, and this doesn't represent me at all anymore. I need to find a place that I can identify with. And so they come to Hayden or they come to Eagle or to someplace else.
You're not landing here. Like you can be in Tahoe and trip and accidentally land in Nevada. Like that's the thing. You're like, oh, I'm in Nevada. I had no idea. No income tax. Fantastic. You're not landing in Eagle, Idaho by accident. Like
you had to make a trek to get here.
This was a real specific direction you went. And not only that, the thing I always found funny about that sentiment is like, okay, how many diehard conservatives that like just bleed red and like have a Trump tattoo, like how many of those people are moving to San Francisco to mess with politics? Like no one.
No, they're moving to Idaho.
Right. And how many Idahoans, like exactly zero. This actually is a zero. It's not a non-zero number. It's a zero number. Zero people have ever been like, I am diehard red. I believe in these politics. I believe in this way of life. Let me move to Oakland or Berkeley and start trying to vote.
I'm going to fight the fight.
I'm going to fight the fight. It's like if anybody has ever done that, holler, because I would love to get into your crazy decision-making process. But
I will say, so one of the interesting things, so we don't see the fear of like between the states, but with this presidential election, I will say one of the interesting groups, it's small in number, but we do have people internationally. So people who've been out of the state or, maybe they grew up here in Idaho. So when I was 3, I was raised in Idaho, and they're trying to justify why they think they should vote in our elections. Now, mind you, we reject these registrations, but we do see like People are like, well, I really feel like I need to vote in the presidential election. Like, you and the rest of the world feel that way. Like, name someone in the world who doesn't feel like they care about America's election, right? We have such a big impact on the world stage, but we vet all of these, right? And so we have people that we reject who say like, yeah, no, you don't meet the criteria to be able to vote in our state. So, go vote in Europe or wherever.
Go do whatever. Yep. Spend your time however you feel best. Secretary of State Phil McGrane, thank you again for a great episode. We have a couple more scheduled, which will be great. Great. One more before the before the election, and then one post-election. We will find out if Prop 1 passes. We're going to find out who's president. We're going to have to get a drink during that last episode. I don't know if you drink, and if you don't, I'll get you an energy drink, and I'll drink a scotch.
We'll have to.
It'll be great. Yeah. Thank you for coming in today. Thanks for what you're doing, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks.